Welcome, everybody, to a special edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you right now. I am currently under a tornado warning, so there is a possibility that this live stream will be interrupted, and hopefully that doesn't happen. But if it does, we will make sure to find time to reschedule whatever we don't get to. This is the second session of the Autonomous Frame of Reference project that Felicia Denaud is hosting. And so with that, I'm going to mostly be off screen and hand it over to Felicia Denaud and our special guest today, Zoé Samudzi, who you all know we've had on the show. Been a while, but we've had her on the audio side a couple of times over the years, and always good to be with both of them. So welcome both of you to Autonomous Frame of Reference, I guess, not really millennials. Thanks, and I'm gonna hand it off to you, Felicia, to take over from here. Thanks.
Jay, thank you so much. And that tornado warning is Earth Against the New World. So it's all happening in real time. But in all seriousness, I thank Jay and his time and energy in putting this together. And Zoe, I thank you for being here today. You really are a special guest. Okay, I thought I was going to do this later, but I'm just going to jump into it. You're a special guest in the sense that you actually have created the permission for me to pursue some of these concepts with your historical rigor and your theoretical creativity around the question of anti-Black genocide, your handling of aesthetics. It is all of the intersections that I'm trying to direct our attention to in my very messy, unfinished project. And so having you here, I think, buoys up the entire thing I'm trying to create, the arguments I'm trying to put on the table, but more importantly, the observations. And so I feel strengthened by your presence and by just the historical perspective that you're going to add, the texture. So
I just want to say the feeling could literally not be more mutual. So as soon as you invited me, I was like, I don't even care what I'm being invited to do. The answer is immediately yes. So I'm super, super glad to be here talking to you.
Thank you. And thank you for everybody participating. This is our second series, Earth Against the New World, and I am your host. But host feels particularly relevant or appropriate today because the questions or the themes that I flagged for you were around this question of habitability, if you really got into the winter, and the question of home. You know, I'm thinking about the exilic nature of Black dispossession. I'm thinking about loss, waywardness, you know, all of these things. And so I have assembled quite a bit as usual, and I'm not even sure if we'll get through all of it. What I've done tonight is I've given myself an hour and 15 minutes, including the visuals that I want us to sit down and watch together, and some reading, of course, from bits and pieces of my work. I've cobbled it together so it'll feel a little jagged in that way, but I'm trying to cover as much territory as I can in this period. So here we go. I'm going to do a warm-in type activity again, ask you to reflect on some quotes, bring you to how I'm thinking about autonomy, some of the concepts that are pillars of this autonomous frame that I'm proposing of Earth Against the New World. So this is my second experiment in an autonomous frame. What happens when you refract our historical experience and political conditions through this idea? What lines of sight emerge on the other end? What kind of clarity might that provide? And I continue to appreciate y'all's generosity because the ideas are big, they're messy, but they're soulful, and I think they're bold. I'm not sure if I even understand them sometimes. So weathering the storm with me matters, and it helps me. It's been helping me develop my ideas. So I ask you to sit with it. I've tried to provide as much text on the screen to follow what I'm saying. I will be reading from drafts and things as well. We'll be looking at visuals, like I said, and we'll see where the evening gets us. I'd like to get to the Manhattan Project and atomic power, but more important is that what I'm going to call the prehistory or the spatial prehistory of the nuclearization of state power. Okay, so I'm more interested in the genocidal and eugenic forces coursing through Africa in an imperial way that arrange and stage something like nuclear capacity. There's something about space, geography, and the image of the earth at stake that's very central in Winter's work and in the pieces that I assign, 1492 worldview. So that's where I'm thinking, is about the space of Africa and its history of being objectified by map making. What that intuition might suggest about absolute and total power, represented in something like nuclearity, which we see with Iran. The question of who can annihilate is the question. And so I want to tie this capacity to annihilate and who has the right back to the spatial history of Africa. And then eventually, definitely not this session, the next one, I'd like to think about the counter map, which is the flesh, scarification of the flesh, and other black maps that we can get into as we re-territorialize ourselves, our mind, figure out how to live in these places again, or renew our claim to life on earth, as I like to call it. Okay, so I've already eaten up my time. I'm going to try to stay on this because the pieces we're watching today matter. A little promotion, like propaganda from Palantir, the software company, a historical documentary, and then something on Shark Island that focuses on German death camps in Africa, the early 20th century, which is an area that Zoé knows much about. Okay, Jay, can I have the next slide? Okay, so sorry, I'm looking at like 5 different screens, so forgive me for darting around. Again, I want to remind or add another kind of layer to this idea of an autonomous frame. I left it kind of at generating the categories that correspond and transform your social reality. And that comes from that first quote from Winter, no point of resistance to its own specific mode of coercion can be fought in terms of the other. So some integrity about the nature of your categories and the nature of the story you tell. On the other side here, I've added as a new thesis of autonomy, Winter's Black Metamorphosis, she says, the task of the 80s remains the continued and unrelenting theoretical delegitimization of the bourgeois representation of reality, of its control of the way we view reality. So I'd like to keep those, and by the third workshop, we'll add another as tenets of autonomy in a Winter sense, or how I'm trying to work with her autonomous frame. Again, I point to the questions of the day. Where are we and how do we find home? You can ask that at any scale. Where are you in your personal life? Where are we in this, moment? Where, et cetera, et cetera. How do we find home? The question of Earth's habitability is urgent, sincere, and it's unevenly distributed, of course. So I want to think about the history of this problem. Where are we? To me, gets totally captured in the slave ship mutiny that happens in the Indian Ocean in 1766. And it kind of connects this question of armed rebellion, but not knowing how to find your way home. Okay, so this question of where are we? All right, next slide. Okay, for the Warman, this is worth the read here. This is from a novel, Nahanda by Yvonne Vera from Zimbabwe. Nahanda is both an ancestral spirit and then the woman that led an anti-colonial resistance to the British new imperial invasion. The book is kind of this poetic take of Nahanda's life, but it's really narrated through the elements, through soil and lakes and rocks and desert. And it really emphasizes this idea of the anti-earth and anti-Black drives mirroring one another. But this scene captured me, and it sets the stage for me about the problem of the map and the problem of where we are. Smith, do you know the difference between us and the natives? The difference is that we know where we are and the native does not. Surely the Africans know the land, Mr. Smith answers dispassionately. These are two colonizers that have like big problems with each other. Obviously, they have two strategies of imperialism. I mean the knowledge of the world that we have. We have drawn maps and know how to locate ourselves on the globe. The native only knows where he is standing. I have been collecting maps since I was a boy. This is what we should teach at the new school, a knowledge of the earth. He taps the table with his fingers. Maps? The native? Mr. Smith looks amused, then continues, what is the use of showing paper to an African? It is simply a consciousness of the world, and of oneself and one's place in it. Mr. Browning's voice is filled with conviction. Map reading? Smith is amused and laughs. Mr. Browning abruptly turns away from him. The African must begin to go somewhere. That sets the stage, the trap of the map, this question of the knowledge of the earth, a science of the earth. Do we have in our toolkit a science of the earth that is neither geology nor environmentalism, but a science of the earth that can account for the mutilation we're going to see in Earth's struggle against New World across this workshop? And then the real aesthetic history of European map making and the evolution of the idea of Africa in the European mapping mind. So I'm going to take you through from the Middle Ages to, hopefully, the Middle Ages to the 15th century, how the shape of Africa consistently moves from a symbolically arranged to a Euclidean, so open space with real measurement, so like a proper representation of Africa. And in that generation of an accurate image, total power and open space always collaborate to generate these new forms of war power. And that's, to me, how I arrive at nuclear power. But the key is this idea of Africa, the way the map becomes the instrument of capture, how there's a kind of cartographic appropriation. Literally, they needed a particular visual of Africa at the Berlin Conference in order to perform a geographic dissection. I think this is why Winter has such a geographic sensibility about the truth, and why she locates Columbus as this kind of emancipator of knowledge and genocidal drive at the same time. Blah, blah, blah. As we build through the resources of today, I hope these ideas reinforce themselves and they make more sense. But this question of the science of the earth, where we stand. Okay. Next slide. These are just some of when I'm thinking about the New World, these are some of the family of concepts I've had to generate to support this exploration. And so there's some things that you'll see flying around today and that we also covered last workshop. So like I said, cartography. The New World obviously is a geographic, a cartographic event. But what does that have to do with Africa? Extermination and mapping as going hand in hand, and abstraction, that representation of space with different levels of accuracy and fidelity, how it's been used as a force of elimination, but also as a form of deception, secrecy, a way of us getting by. We must abstract as well, but in what ways? Atomic power as the culmination of this history of open space in Africa, and the pursuit of absolute power, which I called in the last workshop final agency, that super rational, that above rational drive to realize in historical terms an absolute power. Again, the image of the earth. Underneath every great shift in knowledge is a new earth. You know, when like astronauts go into space, I forget what this is called, the lookover effect, but they have this moment where their like brain registers that they're looking at Earth. I think Winter longs for that experience on Earth itself, to have that like psychic, but epistemic, but perspectival experience where you see yourself as an Earthling. I think that's in part what she's after. I worry about what the war in between will do to us. And that's how I think I fill some of Winter's gaps. Okay, so these are some other terms that are going to pop up today. Next slide. All right, a very high theory experimental take on the New World I'm just going to throw out to you for now. Do with it what you want, but this is where I'm going. And then we'll get into some substance. Okay, so the New World is not a place Columbus discovered in 1492, but a mutation in human experience he advanced across the 15th century. This phenomenological mutation, so this mutation in human experience, introduces an anti-Earth replicator code, a set of instructions about how to relate to Earth. Jefferson, I have this whole piece on how I want to do like Jefferson's theory of the Earth. He has this like one letter he writes about Earth is for the living. He was kind of trying to come up with a theory of property and ownership and descendants. And then Dessalines has this, his kind of counter-revolutionary face in the New World has this theory of Earth as being the place where you avenge the ancestors. Anyways, so a set of instructions about how one humanly relates to Earth, and a master form, a space of action from which to write the set of instructions into reality. So for me, that space of action, Africa, obviously North American New World. But what I want to focus on here is how Africa constitutes a new world and triggers a new world experience. This is very important to Winter because it's in Columbus's voyage around the bulge of Africa. He develops the epistemological courage to challenge the orthodox or the dogma of the day that told him the ship or the voyage he wanted to take was not in fact possible. This is what she is fascinated by, in addition to how the New World event structures, the entire contemporary situation. It's that Columbus has to perform an act of transgression, something heretical to the truth of the time. And then Africa is always lurking experientially within this experience of the West. It's almost like the X factor of the New World is Africa. And it is New World because although it always existed symbolically in Europe's imagination through different kind of mythological constructions, it's in breaking the bulge and being able to go past what they thought was not passable that open space becomes available for thought. And I take this from this amazing European geographer who wrote like one book and then I can't find anything else on him called The Shaping of Africa. That's where a lot of my maps will come from. But he gave me this language of ecumenical space, Christian space, and all the theories about how Christian space is organized by the divine grace of God, fiery pits all around it, a small landmass in a mighty ocean, how this idea shifts through encounters with Africa to compel something like open space, which is necessary for the national state form to me. So I'm trying to bring in absolutism and the spatial life of the absolute state, which is how Europe encounters the New World, is through the infrastructure of the monarchical state. That's very important to me. And then the absolute state starts to engineer new ideas of space, right, that are different than the feudal era. Doesn't carry all of the imbricated and symbolic kind of messiness. The absolute state is about creating open space. And so I want to start to make these parallel processes and start to think about Africa's secret, suppressed, repressed role in liberating geography from one modality to another, and that carrying genocidal forces with it. Whoa, okay. Next slide. 620. Oh, man. All right. So here's where I want to go after all of that speaking. I want to watch a video from Palantir, the software company led by Alex Karp, these demons that are drip feeding actual eugenics into our collective brains, that are stewarding some of the scariest surveillance technology, and that are really part of the de-democratization of the West in crucial ways. But they have this video, it's scary in the way it's just so tech, but this video, and I want you to think about how it's visualizing Earth and this, what they call meta-constellated Earth. So to me, maybe that's the next conjuncture in my little experiment. There's ecumenical Earth, and then there's Euclidean Earth, that open space to conquer and settle and invade Africa. Now we're at metaconstellated Earth, which is about a kind of total datafication of Earth's surface and the extraction and regulation of that data. So we'll watch a little video because I want to throw at you as many images of Earth as possible to start to give this shape. Yes, let's go there first.
Palantir's meta-constellation software harnesses the power of growing satellite constellations, deploying AI into space to provide insights to decision makers here on Earth. Our meta-constellation integrates with existing satellites, optimizing hundreds of orbital sensors and AI models, and allowing users to ask time-sensitive questions across.
They don't want us watching. That's okay.
That's a little creepy. Let me try again.
He heard me.
Are you talking to us?
Let's try it one more time.
To provide insights to decision makers here on Earth. Our meta-constellation integrates with existing satellites, optimizing hundreds of orbital sensors and AI models, and allowing users to ask time-sensitive questions across the entire planet. Important questions, like where are there indicators of wildfires? Or how are climate changes affecting crop productivity? And when and where are naval fleets conducting operations? Meta-constellation pushes Palantir's edge AI technology to a new frontier. As we all know, submarines present threats to the US and its allies. And to protect strategic interests, Allied forces need to track every submarine's deployment around the world. And at the forefront of this challenge are anti-submarine warfare officers. They turn to Meta-constellation to monitor ports across the Pacific. Let me show you a little bit about what that looks like. In response to Allied monitoring requests, Meta-constellation dynamically determines which orbiting sensors are available. Integrated through Palantir, the constellations then collaboratively schedule coverage over each port. Meanwhile, Apollo for Edge AI assigns tailored AI micromodels to each satellite. Running on board the satellite, the models will automatically find submarines and stream those insights directly to users. With the mission planned, Apollo automatically reconfigures each of the satellites, pushing the right micromodels into orbit. And as a software payload on board, Palantir's Edge AI platform connects complex satellite subsystems to models, integrating new AI with the hardware. The best part, my favorite part, is that as it orbits, the Edge AI platform hot swaps the right micromodels in, rapidly reconfiguring the satellite. The models process imagery, they detect submarines, geolocate them, and then determine any movement since the last collection pass, all in under a second. When the AI sees a submarine movement, that insight is directly downlinked to Allied forces as the satellite passes overhead, and the anti-submarine warfare officers are notified in just minutes, empowering them to respond in a way that we've never seen before. As you can tell, we're really excited about Palantir's Meta-constellation and see it as the software that brings hundreds of satellites to bear on your hardest problems. Whether it's the anti-submarine warfare officer that I just described, using it to find submarines, or first responders leveraging AI to spot wildfire signs. Meta-constellation is there to empower users.
Okay. Zoe, also, if at any time in between these little snippets and things you speak, if you'd like, please. Because you know me, I'm just going to... But of course, at the end, I'm going to invite you to respond totally. So, but just reminding you. Okay, so I'm going to read an extended prompt for the workshop now so that you do have some sense of how the whole mapping of Africa to atomic power thing plays out. But like I said, I want to make some pit stops to a slave ship mutiny and to Shark Island to think about the complement or like the parallel forces of atomic power represented in the elimination of African space and life. But also the way we perform rebellion around these conditions and what we can learn when we can't quite get there. That's why the mermaid is really important. So let me read this, and then I'm going to read the intro of the chapter that deals with this material. And it's more of like a poetic take on thinking with Earth. I mean, that's the point of today, is one could tell the history of Africa through a history of Earth itself, with deep listening and deep knowledge. There's a synonymity there to me that is energetic, and it is autonomous. It's about that, again, that singular situation in the world that Du Bois nodded to in the African Roots of War, for and of Africa. All right, so let me see where this takes us, and then Mermaid, Shark Island, and we'll see where we are. I think I'm pretty good for time. Okay, in Earth Against, actually, do you want to go to the next slide? I'm gonna skip the recap because, well, if you weren't here, no, I'm kidding. And you can keep going. Yeah, that's good. Okay. In Earth Against the New World, we press on with creation stories, founding operations, and the elusive subjective factor, right? That's a huge part of Winter's preoccupations with a human perspective. Is there a science of the subjective factor? Is that the science of the word? Could that collectively, this is what she writes in 1492, create a new, what does she call it? Moral evolutionary history of the human. And that's, again, what she's after. 1492 within a new human perspective. Okay, so the subjective factor, it would require a proper appreciation of the subjective factor in her account. Okay, this time we take a circuitous tour through the relationship between open space and absolute power. The New World is a glitch, an anti-Earth replicator code, not a place discovered, but a mutation advanced. Africa, it is too often forgot, was Columbus's indispensable prelude. Africa is also the New World. More importantly, Africa's world configuring function in the West transition from ecumenical Earth to Euclidean Earth, from a symbolically mediated mental continuum of inhabitable space, not fragmented into continents. So imagine your image of the world does not include continents. It includes a space of divine, a land of divine grace, surrounded by condemnation in various ways that are contradictory. You know, there's Aristotelian theory that's struggling against empirical experiences as Europeans travel farther and farther against biblical interpretation. So it's really interesting, all of the modes of knowledge that are woven together to create the image and the idea of Africa. Okay. But our sort of attention to these spatial registers and the spatial transformation, I think, opens the door to a lot of insights. Among them, a shadow paradigm, a Black account of that science of destruction, atomic power, and the drive for final agency. What does Africa have to do with the most ambitious military project in history? Everything, let's presume. Africa is prime cause, writes Du Bois in the African Roots of War, of this terrible overturning of civilization. He's speaking of World War I, which we have lived to see, and thus, and these words seek to show how in the dark continent are hidden the roots not simply of war today, but of war tomorrow. Semper novi quid ex Africa. Always Africa is giving something new or some metempsychosis of a world-old thing. Metempsychosis is like reincarnation in the Greek world. So Africa is always giving something new, some metempsychosis of a world-old thing. That is insightful. Nearly every human empire that has arisen in the world, material and spiritual, has found some of its greatest crises on the continent of Africa. It was the geologic scandal of the 20th century, a freak of nature occurrence, one army general declared. Nothing like it had ever again been found. Out of this scandalous geologic scene, this brought with it a science of human destruction, a technology so cheap, so portable, so holocaustal. Katanga, of course, was the scandal that set the West afoot. The mineral density and diversity of the southeastern province of present-day Democratic Republic of Congo has made it the focal point of colonial desire and design. Katanga serves as a means to discuss the stewardship of Earth's generative powers and the ongoing conversion of Earth power into war and police power. In the early 20th century, imperial geologists determined that the Shinkolobwe mine in Katanga was home to a, quote, remarkable reserve of uranium. By World War II, it became the indispensable and defining planetary source. The Congo was of central importance to America. Without access to this mine, it's very unlikely that the bomb would have been built. Okay, so that process is what I'm interested in. I'm going to take you now how I think about, I'm going to read a little bit about thinking with Earth. I'm going to invite Zoe to make comments, and then we're going to go into the video. What were you doing during the war, during Earth's rebellion against world, property, and its human overseers? Oh, you can go ahead to some of the slides. I think I have one with this stuff, but maybe not. Okay. Where were you as Earth skin, lacerated by the deadly life of logistics, by border rule, and the omnipotent technocrats, and the citizenship of stuff, by subsoil bondage and vertical infinity? Yeah, you can go back to like 2 slides. Where were you as Earth's skin violently welded the human wound? What did you feel as Earth advanced an era of counter-logistics against the conversion of the underworld's fire-controlling and earth-shaking denizen? That's from a Polynesian writer who talks about how Earth gets flattened in this horrifying way, where the underworld becomes geology and hell. The monotheistic colonization of the celestial order, the sky, the moon, the planets, by the Christian chosen and saved. Did you answer the call to conspire, to interrupt the conversion of Earth power into war power? Did you indict the forced labor of trees and soil, currents and winds in this ceremony of scarification called development, called progress, called modernization? Have you touched the sclerotic body of the red oak, bred to bear strange fruit? Quote, you never see limbs like that nowadays. The tree was bred for it. You think that tree don't know? There have been some dead folk here. That's from a Southern ethnography of lynching trees. Have you listened to the cypress cry? Quote, that'll tree will talk to you if you stand out here in the dark. You'll know that Negro crying out to you, man. Can't you hear it? Unquote. Did you know that trees too are the humanist narrative? That our scars are trees, our earth tissue, our evidence from beloved. School teacher made one open up my back, and when it closed a tree, it grows still there. That's the famous scar on Setha's back that has this like shifting symbolic, it can be visually become something depend on the viewer. But she calls it the tree on her back. So I'm trying to see the skin of the earth and black skin and the ways in which we bring these together to make sense of what's happening on both scales. Did you know these trees are all we have? And all we have is more than enough. I got a tree on my back and a haunt in my house and nothing in between but the daughter I'm holding in my hands. No more running from nothing. Also, beloved, like Setha, let us stand where we are, we people with no standing. Let us run from nothing. We act in abolition not for ground to stand on, but for groundations beyond standing. I think that's Milton. After all, there are no more places to run. Into the woods, Masséna Perrault advised her son, the mother of Haitian revolutionary that fought against the Marine occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1992. She would write letters to him saying, "Into the woods." And then he was known as the last Maroon of Haiti. So the last Maroon made his bid only to be betrayed and executed, only for Haiti to be subjected to the first aerial bombardment in the West, the first act of vertical infinity in the Western Hemisphere. And that was more than a century ago. In search for groundations beyond standing, we have produced ritual inversions. These ceremonies refuse the conversion of terrestrial density into the flattened commodity form. Our ceremonies transmute that original terror of abstraction, that homogenization of Earth's surface and substance into a geometric void without substance or quality. That's from Carlo Galli, an Italian political theorist I love. We take all of that and we create an outlawed measure. That is abstraction against the itinerary of conquest, against Black people as informatic bit code inventory and computational matrix. Could you go to the turquoise Dyson slide? I think it's the next two. Right there, yeah. In the work of turquoise Dyson, we find a counter geometry and ritual of data theft that appropriates the authority of abstraction from master state and archive to create new planes from which an architecture of the living may emerge. Black people, sky and shorelines, trees and their ecologies are all approached through interpretive form that privileges unkeeping. Under what conditions can unkeeping a place or thing become a means of developing a deeper understanding of our own genealogy? Geometric decomposition. So she takes the auction block, she takes the lynching tree, and she creates these visual data pieces to use abstraction to formulate another map of the issue, of the problem. I think this idea of like geometric decomposition as data visualization against the record, it takes us back to our original ways of marking humanness, which is the symbol. And Luba writing and the writing and the scarification share etymology in word. And so there are forms of abstraction that have made home for us that we must return to. But I think we have to go through the cartographic, this capture, this spatiality to get back or to get forward, to remake writing and symbolization as a human, shared human thing that we all do. Anyway, so Dyson calls this illegal abstraction of dissent. And it challenges abstraction as a comprehensive condition related to industrialization and capital accumulation and all of that. And so I want to take with us, I don't always want to say, oh, they have the maps and they take total power and they have the atom bomb, and always thinking about the ways our spatial presence, that immeasurable presence of Black perception, as Dyson calls it, frustrates, challenges, doubts, hinders, contains runaway white supremacist power. That dynamic is there, always there, persistently there. And we have to fight for the tools, the autonomy of the tool and the autonomy of the strategy. My God, I could keep going. Okay, Zoe, I'm going to stop there for a second, invite you, see what you're thinking, and then we can go into the mermaid documentary.
Yeah, oh my goodness. I have so many scribbles that I had to go through with a highlighter to figure out what was supposed to be a response and what was just my notes. But I really am appreciative that you started with Mbuya Nehanda, because of the kind of political significance, obviously, that she has in the liberation struggle as it both existed and is weaponized by the Zimbabwean state. Folks, for folks who are not familiar, so Nehanda is separate from Nehanda the person. So Nehanda is the name of the Mondoro, the spirit, the ancestral spirit that inhabits mediums. So the woman was named Charwe Nyakasikana And then she has then became Nehanda Nyakasikana when the spirit inhabited her, I think in the late 1880s. But, when you were talking about, genocide as this kind of realization of ecumenical space, part of the myth, or maybe the most important myth of Nehanda, is the fact that when they captured her and her kind of husband, Kaguvi, it was really hard to execute her. And before they executed her, I mean, I obviously got this tattooed because as much as I hate the nation state, I am a secret nationalist. Cancel me, fine. She's like, my bones will rise again. And then she dies. And then there's this kind of symbolic destruction of a thing. And there's something, of course, in so many cultures, you have to bury people properly. You have to ensure that the dead successfully become ancestors or you'll be haunted. In this case, rather than a kind of familial haunting and kind of ruination of the lineage, you have her unsettled bones kind of animating the earth, animating this energy that brings about the kind of second Chimurenga, as she was an important spirit medium in fighting against the originary settlement of the British in what they then called Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia. And so there's a reason then, because I want to be in writing about genocide and in trying to approach genocide from the position of the community and of the dead, rather than this kind of insistence on law and its creation of a particular kind of legible, protected juridical subject. The way that you describe this Christian space, I think, and the kind of transgression and transformation of the space through these cartographies, there's a very interesting link for me between this map making and Lebensraum, which is a different register and a different grammar of this ecumenical space through the kind of rational science of racecraft, of understanding the national polity or the racial polity or the whatever kind of polity as a biological unit with natural borders and natural competition and a natural elimination of any weaker polity or group of people that interferes with the natural expansion of the species, in this attempt to appropriate Oscar Peschel, writing about Charles Darwin in German, and then kind of translating this, misappropriating, I guess, the evolution or evolutionary theory into human geography and attempting to apply these laws of nature to the natural behavior of civilization. And so I think about genocide as a destruction. If I want to conflate, as I have to conflate, Nehanda, her body with the spirit and her bones and the land, I have to understand genocide as a killing of land, which means that genocide is a killing of God. Of all of these different kinds of gods that emerge from different communities' understandings and different communities' relation to land. And I think in the context of Palestine, where on the one hand, there's something incredibly frustrating of people trying to fabricate all of these different grammars of lowercase g genocide, if capital G genocide doesn't suit, but as a kind of, as a descriptor of what genocide is, right? Which is this kind of trans-temporal annihilation of a people, right? It's an eradication of a people's history through a destruction in the present to foreclose the possibility of existence in the future. I was really compelled by, what is it? The Palestine, what did I write? The Palestinian Feminist Collective and their description of sophicide, which is the deliberate annihilation of indigenous knowledge traditions that are inspired by the land itself. And that includes the destruction of churches, of cemeteries, universities, the destruction of elders, of archives, of farms, of fisheries, of everything that that facilitates the possibility of Palestinian life. And so, I'm not especially religious and I'm not especially sentimental, but if I'm taking seriously what the destruction of a people is, which is primarily the inability for people to become ancestors, for people to die properly, to be able to be buried on their own land specifically, then the kind of counter to this imperial imposition of these cartographic frames, these ecumenical or hyper rational racial frames, like, has to be this kind of spiritual, mystical, esoteric, whatever, because we are haunted by our dead. We are haunted by the fact that they have never been able to be buried. When I talk to, and when we'll talk about Shark Island in a moment, but when I talk to, Ovaherero and Nama descendants of genocide survivors and the dead, they talk about the genocide being ongoing because of their, ancestral remains being incarcerated in museums. Yeah. Because they might be physically dead, but because they have not been interred, they are not dead, particularly because a number of these ancestral remains come from graves that were excavated after they had been buried properly. So genocide has to become both material and metaphysical, because I'm not going to be one to kind of positively quote Raphael Lemkin, because Raphael Lemkin had some really horrendous things to say about Black people and the way that Black people tried to challenge the genocide concept. But even
this is the person that came up with the concept of genocide.
Right, I should have said, yeah. The person who coined the term. And it was a really kind of a frame that was critical of colonialism, a frame that looked at the Spanish annihilation of indigenous people in the so-called New World, in the Americas. But he has a kind of sociological frame of genocide that is beyond the kind of legal codification, and it thinks about the spiritual, the material, the physical, the psychic, the everything. So when you destroy a people, it can't be distilled to this idea of a rote change in demography. You have annihilated a life world and everything in it. And I think that any good and honest account of genocide, which is not, of course, the genocide mostly that the courts are actually at all, that the courts are all that interested in. But the ancestors, the ghosts, the haunted, they are the specters that are haunting everything we do always have to be attended to and accounted for. I'm thinking about this Lebanese writer, Jalal Tufik, who wrote this book called Vampires. And he's like, when Zionism is over, like, we have to attend, and there's this imagining of reparations or something. We have to attend to whatever is haunting us. We give the reparations and the recompense to the living, but what are we giving to the dead? What does it mean that, maybe the bones eventually go back to Namibia, and there are a bunch of bones in Namibia that have been sent back from Germany that are being held in state archives, because the state and the community are arguing about where they go. Do the remains go into a national museum, into the Heroes Acre, and get forcibly assimilated into the national project, or do they go to the ancestral homelands? But then if they're to go to the ancestral homelands and are probably owned by white farmers. And so you have to ask permission for your people to be born, to be buried on the lands of these white landowners, formerly owned by these white landowners, who many of whom are the descendants of German settlers, as well as Afrikaners and kind of other whites. And what if they say no? What does it mean also when there is an attempt to finally reinter the bones, return these remains to the earth, and you are not given permission to do that? You have all of these kind of bureaucratic structures that, finally they give permission, and permission feels so crass in the face of the kind of devastation and
it's part of the master power thing that I'm after.
absolutely.
That drive or that private capacity for coercive power that's embedded in the new world for me puts into motion this master state complex. And so much of the afterlife of genocide, or this haunting, is stewarded by masters in these private ways. And we can get into, in Shark Island, the function of the tourist in desecrating the African death camp, right? And the way Earth carries white enjoyment over literal the bones of which you were just speaking, and the way the geography of Shark Island functioned as a way of barring invasion for so long. And when when our inability to conspire with Earth gets diminished, and the kind of all of the things that you're speaking about become, to me, the function of the new world, that glitch, that replicator code, this repeated, this desecration at the metaphysical to the material, as you said, which is, key, because one thing I wanted to point out about winter is, and then I want you to finish, and I think actually we should go to Shark Island first. It's so, with what you just said, it makes sense. But for me, winter has this, I'm going to go to my own slide, this preoccupation with Columbus and Copernicus, who gives us the heliocentric model. Earth is not in the middle of reality, the sun is, and it's also moving. And Darwin, who liberates human origins from divine descent. She wants to study the way one can organize and achieve an epistemological break that involves a miraculous reordering of material reality itself. And that, in this conversation we're having, is what the tools that I'm after, is to reorder the way we actually see the space of the earth, this haunting, to see the haunting, to see the way Palantir visualizes Earth in its desire to totally appropriate all earthly knowledge. I wish we had that capacity to see Earth through all its genocidal, like all the genocidal drives and dispossessions, to see it totally and propose a counter image of the Earth after this. What would the map look like? To me, it is very exciting. And it would involve all of these kind of repatriations that you're speaking about, and how they're caught up in juridical and national and then ancestral. And that's the work that we will be doing when this ends, when we bring, in Winter's words, this 500-year history to a close, which is the task. That's the goal. It's the task, is to end this. And on the other side of that is all of this work that you're speaking about. It would be to remake the image of the earth in a way that defends everything from Palestine to the Nama that you just pointed out. So it's really beautiful, but this idea that theory has the capacity to unlock the theories of material reality. So when people say materialism, theory gives us the secrets of materialism when it's done well. And I think that's what is after, a miraculous reordering of material reality through this new metaphysical, this new like minding thing that we do when we're finally and fully human, or like whatever. So do you have any other thoughts? I think going straight into Shark Island.
Yeah, I'll have Shark Island thoughts. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll do about 16 minutes of this documentary. I had asked participants last week to pick one report from forensic architecture, because to me, they are stewarding a science of the earth that weds digital technology to some of these great decolonial methods, like that just aren't like anthropological. They're quite, the way they're layering method to, again, unlock material secrets of Earth that we know to be true, but that we need to create an archive around, is powerful. And this specific place, to me, captures my imagination. So it's, now we're like getting down into a specific place. So take the really heady ideas and now watch this.
báo cáo trên how đại chưa cổ sao mà ta你是大chưa cổ hả我biết tu我大cái đại tan chỉ cáo trên nè si sen cu chưa cổ mà ô kabar kubam badare idan hang haure how ta ni kabar hama ba daran ngona si sen ka hai ta si hadi
For centuries, the Namib Desert, stretching for over 1,000 miles along the Atlantic coast of southwest Africa, served as a natural shield, concealing the region's indigenous populations from European colonizers. But a geological singularity, a massive rock cutting through the sand dunes, known today as Shark Island, created a natural harbor, a point of entry. German settlers arrived here in 1883. The merchant Adolf Ludwig gave his name to their first settlement. And so through this rock, the German colonial occupation of Southwest Africa was made possible. By 1905, Shark Island was the site of an extermination camp at the heart of the first genocide of the 20th century. Over 4,000 indigenous Nama and Ovaherero people are estimated to have been murdered here by the German colonial army. Yet few physical traces of this history remain on the island today.
After 30 years of independence, Shark Island continues to be a tourist destination where visitors may freely walk on sacred ground and wine and dine on the bones of the heroes and heroines who started the earlier resistance against colonial occupation in Namibia.
Why would you be on the site of a crime scene when you can clearly see that it's not a crime scene? Of course it's a crime scene. People were killed here. People were executed here.
From where are you?
I'm from here. I'm in Namibia. You're obviously comfortable being on the site of this murder. You're very comfortable. You yourself said like it's okay. It doesn't matter because it happened 100 years ago.
Seeking to uncover the lost history of colonial violence, forensic architecture and forensics collaborated with descendants of survivors and victims of the genocide. Guided by oral testimonies from traditional leaders and historians of the Nama and Ovaherero, we used digital architectural models to meticulously reconstruct the Shark Island concentration camp, rock by rock.
This part of our history is slowly being completely erased. And we are trying to halt that situation so that our history is not erased and we have the evidence to make the rightful claims.
우리 아이파티 땀 지결에 우리 바 가바시다 디코이나 옹마 다이쳤게 나디 왕와하 나이체스 사라기니 칭와라 다이
the original name of Shark Island itself actually is Ngamingus. Ngamingus means embrace. This was the name given to the island because it was encircled and surrounded by the ocean, by the sea. During the genocide, the island itself morphed into an extermination camp for the Nama and the Ovaherero people.
A German map from 1906 shows the layout of the island and the general location of the camp. By the time of the first aerial photographs, however, all man-made traces of the camp had been erased. Decades of development followed, burying the island's history under tourist campsites, luxury houses, and an industrial port. In 2024, Namibian authorities plan to expand the port, despite objections from the Nama and Ovaherero, further erasing traces of the genocide which occurred here. Germany denies responsibility for Shark Island's preservation. All that remains to connect the present to the past is the island's rocks. Sculpted by the wind and water, they made the architecture of the camp. These rocks are visual anchors. Identifying them enabled us to locate the few remaining archival photos of the camp. Using photogrammetry, we built a precise digital model of the island, paying close attention to its topography and the textures of the rocks. Our model became a spatial archive within which to locate these photographs in order to reconstruct the camp and the experiences of its prisoners.
Imperial Germany's campaign of finding a living space, or Lebensraum, had no bounds. It embraced total destruction of communities and peoples living in its pathway. Once they could not achieve the total end of destroying these communities, they also had to round up people and put them in what later on in Europe became known as concentration camps. So in these camps, people had to be worked to death. People had to die through malnourishment. They had to be brought to Shark Island as prisoners of war, but also slave laborers.
The entrance to the island is pictured in this colonial postcard from 1905. Using archival photographs such as this, we reconstructed the architecture of the camp.
Sida di koin aman ki hiwe tai cerku khatsi ai bekturo na praks na taramus na sagere kuru kayesa. Nga ka ma umros naske security kuti umgisa isna khwama isin titskere karusa. Nabaske tuan kere indi mamantin indi dadantina hu toraisa. Nedi ama nedi nga di je mutska o nga sodaku di tongide nga neski nga enhang sa amai. Nesa ngai onmod lek ispatia ngurisi omro chi nausa nauskege neski amai. Ngaskege nga kaigwe agu.
Oral testimonies animate our digital reconstruction, spanning the gaps between the archival photographs to expand our understanding of the camp.
So nga doras nga ngwisti nga mainland di doras amai. Nga stikangske eske komste se vakuhang ngai kaiba. Koini wang wagau gigi kai di chance ka chu rip na guni ko.
This image shows the Herero section of the camp. They were the first people to be brought to the island. Placing this archival photograph within our 3D model reveals that this part of the camp has been buried to make way for a tourist campsite.
To lagu ching ngan namro de dire khajire dosun khonji nan ngan di toru bai awabjire was wa timis wa ye ogme omeji kai ya ngada dai yana tigiren nga sagong ina ngidi going in digiren ayay gu khonji in ngai soro de khangai ngai gu ka
nebaske as sit as tin kan khuna gere tamisa sit hai masi ngap ke nga nang hubai da goro ngam cha cha go kum ngadi ke chang ui chaba khoi kha a ma bai wa ba nga kha ke nga ku ke khio ingu ti si se na ko ni ding wa ka khi tin ni dia hinga ka ta ai be turo si se ni as tin.
We identified this rock marked with a distinctive cross cutting through its surface in this archival photograph.
Idarang ngai warada anisha a min khaske amai khwen ngan je hugane huri am masi yang u amai chinje nga khon amagi khai chisking wasa usta cheswa sa komo girit kom chiga chufu o sigire chando sa giren habu
Timine shak islands la trius nasa vieri nera ne che komi nera ne che kom vieri wa nap ka tri ami chi ngan wa nga gere na khoi na hinka ka tau vandat ai ba sense ne shak islands ne ski dies ne na nguisas na mingusas ke khoi na tam is among ka ki die.
Where prisoners once sheltered, a washroom has been erected, defacing this location, much like many other parts of the island. At the heart of the island, around this rock, numerous memorials commemorate the perpetrators of the genocide. Also among them, however, is one dedicated to Cornelius Fredericks, a Nama leader who was detained and decapitated here in February 1907. In 1906, on this very spot, a photo was taken of the captured Nama and Ovaherero resistance fighters who had been brought to the island to die, including Cornelius Fredericks.
kap gurneli ching ipkangu ching amagu ya girit kamgu aku yom dren dri onor ji khwega aku je kham asesa ye anaga chi mi ba itorop godowa dimi chi ge awon chi kaung ga chi ge ko so ngaba hu ye khaba ane namis nga to eta to hai chi ge english sakailan chi to khabo ang khosi gi khu ga badmasi tara di chi don chin wan ka
Tira ge on kai sindagao a Cornelius Christian Frederick shak islands as a ye ui sa se kaung ngata naip kes ang ngata naip kes kakabistina ipti kam nguri sa tagi.
Fredericks, a proud resistance leader, was worn down after over a year of exposure on Shark Island, as a later photograph shows.
Teacher kwachan ai oskemut kamu iteres volgens nesaki nga kawai kamu bi kapkiri unisa karoku am ko ichimu badi ko nguta ngan karoku kakungwa kaisa uri tira khere khamai uri ti of taina ngara khere khana khamai ske torai sorosa hus khauka iku ke teacher ka ke sor.
Okay. And like I said, I feel like as we travel through the different places and conditions that I set up tonight, the argument begins to reinforce itself, or the observation about this open space annihilation and remapping now in its touristic iteration, or whatever this mode we're in. But the layering and the resurrection that forensic architecture is up through is at the soul of some of your observations, Zoe, and some of the things that I'm trying to put together. So I wonder if you'll give us a few remarks, because I know you have experience with this effort and a lot of these efforts to bring Germany's many genocides into its national consciousness.
Yeah.
And then we will go to our last video, and I'll finish with some other ideas about the New World quickly. So, Zoe.
Yeah. Yeah, the movie, the film is a lot. When there was a caption at the Baldum, the Volkerkunde Museum in Dresden, and that was actually the archive where, or the museum where, that I found a pretty vast collection of photographs by this military officer, what was his name? MAKC, who actually had been sent to Southwest Africa as a part of the Nama counterinsurgency, and ends up actually becoming a really important figure in the Aryanization and de-Judification of the Freikorps. And he actually is the leader of the Freikorps unit that Heydrich, who is the man who is known as the architect of the Nazi final solution, was actually a part of as a child, or as a 15-year-old. So there's some interesting kind of continuities of German imperial to fascist militarism. And so they're using a number of the images that are in his albums. There are 6 physical photo albums with photographs that he took himself. And there are a number of them of the concentration camp. I mean, I had never seen before a kind of meticulous documentation of the genocidal process. And, you know me, I hate Holocaust analogies, but it's really astounding to see people with these numerical marks on their body being loaded into these open kind of train cars and moved on this railroad system from the kind of central and southern interior to the coast. And I think a really important part of the cartographic, the map making, lies with the kind of spatial disorientation of creating these systems of concentration camps that are so far away from where people have been brought. There were camps in, there was a camp in Windhoek. There's a photograph of these kind of huts near a fort. I believe that is the Alte Feste, which was the fort of the imperial soldiers in the capital. But the kind of worst of the concentration camps were in on the southwestern coast. The confrontation that one of the members of the forensics team has with this white, probably South African. South Africans are apparently the most numerous tourists that come to Shark Island to go camping, which unsurprising. But you have this Black Namibian being like, you think this is fine just because this was 100 years ago. And there's a book I really like called Who Counts by Diane Nelson. And it's about these numerological systems in Guatemala that indigenous Guatemalans are using against these kind of ethno-mathematics of death counts and death tolls and reparations figures and the importance of the number 0. And I think about how the German Museums Association, when I was writing my dissertation, put out this kind of or had created this kind of guiding principle for restitution. And it said that we believe that a specific family is no longer going to make a claim for an individual family member after about 5 generations. So they're based on their own kind of memoriological and familial sensibility. They believe that after about 125 years, communities, peoples will no longer be interested in trying to make claims for restitution. I think that they have this kind of 125 years, but then follow it up with, we'll assess this on a case-by-case basis, which is a real fucking cop-out. But it's so interesting to have the kind of empirical arrogance of establishing 125 years when you have people in the present who are quite literally named for their ancestors. You have the great-grandson of Cornelius Frederick being like, this is what happened to my grandfather, my great-great-grandfather. This is what he looked like before he was executed. And, the difference between the kind of colonial ethnomathematic and the reliance on the kind of paper, right? The very beginning, what's the point of giving the Africans paper? To some extent, there's not a point because most of us don't have written language. But what we do have is a really kind of potent oral tradition, and we don't need sociologists to kind of verify the veracity and the accuracy and the consistency of the kind of the quality of memory that comes from oral traditions, where you have people who were born a century after a camp was erected, and because of the family members who survived and whatever means of disseminating information that came out of the camps, you can show them a map and you can say, this is where this was, this is where the soldiers lived, this is where of course, there was a concentration camp physician that was running experiments on the prisoners. This is where that tent was. This is where the building where the women were responsible for scraping and cleaning the skulls of the dead that were to be transported back to Germany. There's such a clear understanding of the geography, even in the absence of this marking of land. And the marking of land also becomes very interesting when you think about the terrain and you think about the way that the desert behaves, which is to say the desert does not behave. The desert is probably one of the handful of biomes that is land that is unenclosable. It cannot be, it can be, but with a tremendous amount of resources, right? It can be made enclosable. It can be brought into a structure of primitive accumulation, but it's incredibly difficult. And so in the absence of the technology to transform the desert into productive space, it became productive space because the deserts became killing fields. The deserts were used as this kind of apocalyptic, life-ending space. So, Namibia geographically is enclosed between 2 deserts. And as someone who cannot handle heat, it's a really miserable place to be. I had nosebleeds all the time. Yeah, not a fan. But it's the most livable parts, kind of the central plateau, which is where the Germans settled. On the eastern interior, going into Botswana, you have the Kalahari Desert. And the Kalahari Desert was used when, after the Battle of Waterberg, which was the Ovaherero were ambushed, they were pushed into the desert to die in the desert, and the Germans had been there and had poisoned wells. And so when they came out, you saw people and dead animals around wells that they had tried to drink out of. And so the survivors of Waterberg were brought then to the concentration camps, to the desert on the Namib. So you have both of these deserts being utilized for their inhospitable conditions and the annihilatory potential that they offered, because, you know, even if they couldn't be made profitable in the sense that they couldn't be grazed on and you couldn't farm on them, they could be productive land in other ways. And the thing about the desert also, and one of the, I think, the incredible things about the forensic architecture film, and the way that part of the way that they map is through weather patterns. And so it's looking at the transformation of the rock, the wind and the rain, and what, you know,
the rock as the witness. I'm still stuck on that.
The rock as the witness. I mean, I found a photograph of a church service in the concentration camp, this missionary service, and they matched it's not in the film, but I think they might have added it into a different cut, but they matched like the cut of the rock in the thing, and they were able to map it onto a different side of the concentration camp that they hadn't mapped before. And so again, as you were saying, like not a completely, because we're using all of these kind of geological tools, but a very different kind of grammar and intention of mapping land, rather than kind of this photographic and technological surveying for extraction. It's rather understanding and giving some reenacting justice, I guess, in understanding the conditions in which, you know, these ancestors worked themselves, were forced to work to death, or died because of the ridiculously inhospitable elements, or because of starvation, or the diseases that were running through the camps, or whatever else. And I think it's interesting to then see the way that Germany insists upon its denial of the genocide. And, you know, I think that there are lots of different registers of genocide denial. It's not just like, you know, Turkey being like, we didn't do anything to the Armenians, but if we did do something, don't make us finish the job kind of thing. Germany's kind of grammar of denial is, you know, you have on one hand the joint declaration, this declaration that was co-authored with the Namibian government, where they take there's like special moral responsibility. There's a kind of description of colonial crimes and atrocities. So there is a kind of recognition that Germany has made. And then on the other hand, you know, when the Nama and Ovaherero took the German government to court to try to challenge its claims to sovereign immunity, you have the Germans saying, you know, the alleged concentration camps, the alleged this, the alleged that, obviously, right, because once you admit something in court, then you are on the hook for having to pay reparations. And the Germans are insistent that they don't have to pay reparations. And why don't they have to pay reparations? Because genocide was not a crime until 1948. Genocide was not invented until 1948. And of course, we know that despite the fact that Germany was party to both the Hague and I believe the Geneva Conventions, both of which prohibit these acts of annihilatory warfare, you know, we know from Bembe and necropolitics that the armies of the uncivilized do not constitute the kind of legible fraternal army that would be treated as equals under these principles of just war. And so that is their strategic workaround, what is called in law the intertemporal principle, that a legal question can only be answered through the legal principles of the time. So if genocide was not a crime, and if the Nama and the Ovaherero were not recognized as a kind of sovereign polity, but were rather subject to the dominion and the suzerainty of Imperial Germany, then they cannot make a claim to the kind of sovereign subjecthood that would allow them under international law to assert that, regardless of the fact that genocide was not a crime, all of the acts of genocide were a crime, and so therefore we are entitled to XYZ. And what they actually challenged in court was this idea of, again, sovereign immunity, and they were saying that the sale of skulls from this Austrian anthropologist to the American Museum of Natural History, that has a massive collection of human ancestral remains from all over the world, including obviously Black Americans. But they were saying that that constitutes unlawful criminal activity because the skulls were acquired through illegal means. But again, we have this intertemporal difference in what constitutes legality. And also, if they were able to successfully claim that unlawful sale of human remains or unlawful sale of anything constitutes an undermining of a European sovereign immunity, then every single community around the world would be using that exact same alien tort law in New York to say, I mean, the Haitians would have all kinds of claims to make. Everybody would have all kinds of claims to make. And so it was the law's desire and need to protect the sovereignty of imperial property. And if they were to rule in favor of the Nama and the Ovaherero, even though, I mean, I read the case, the kind of the language in the case law, I'm not a legal girly by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a pretty sound argument. They would then have to entertain this reverse of colonial flows. They would, because all of these communities would insist using exactly the same rationale. And so it's super interesting to see how, despite the Holocaust being framed as the kind of origin of genocide, even the origin of 20th century genocide or modern genocide, as it will, there are so many components of the Nama and Ovaherero genocide that really frame, one, the structure of annihilation, two, obviously the Germans were not the first to use concentration camps. In fact, the British had used them against the Boers at the end of the 19th century. But there are these rationales and logics of denial that are kind of interesting. And then when we think about Gaza, then there's a way that Holocaust exceptionalism is only made possible through, let's not think about Europe as the starting point, let's think about rather the colony as the starting point, the kind of twinned denialisms and dispossessions, both of Palestine and of indigenous people in Southwest Africa. It is through Nakba denialism and the refusal to fully recognize the Nama and Ovaherero genocide that anchors the Holocaust as this kind of archetype of the camp, of the racial language, of extermination, of transportation, of all of these things, even though, you know, after Namibia, Germany helped the Ottomans do it in across the kind of Ottoman Empire in the genocide against Armenians. So as you're describing, there are all of these, you know, it's a fractal technology. It's not a repetition. It's just the structure is the same, and every kind of constituent part does the same thing.
Yes.
And we can kind of see these constellations and these samenesses, obviously to not flatten out the uniquenesses and specificities of any given geography, of any given structure and process of violence. But there is something, to me at least, that seems quite, I mean, depressing, but also clarifying about the fact that it has never changed, and it is so efficient. That is why it has never changed. And perhaps the way that we map in opposition or as a counter or towards some kind of emancipatory relation to Earth and to space and to one another, that's something that we take advantage of.
Gosh. No, I'm very grateful how you're able to travel different historical experiences so fluently without sacrificing their their historical specificity, but being able to reach with my concept. It's really important. And I just don't think that the settler invasion of Africa registers properly as the a singular demographic event in human history. I mean, Europe brought 1/5 of the world's landmass into centralized control within like 30 years.
Yeah.
Part of the argument I'm trying to develop. Jay, could you put up, there's just a couple of slides where I define the New World, and then just to show the maps. Okay, next one. Okay, here. So for this one, this is kind of the evolution in the spatial representation of Africa that I'm interested in. But in each iteration of the kind of cartographic capture of Africa seems to fuel a political form that feeds the West's capacity for kind of final agency. That's a little argument I'm trying to stage, that in the process across this version of mapping, in each, if you can go back a slide, you arrive at this iconic photo of the Berlin Conference, 1884, where Europe sat down and decided by blood. So there's a misconception that this was really done by paper. Although it was a paper affair, it was backed up by obviously genocide and military aggression. So that's something that historians, I don't know, it troubles me. But this image is what got me started, because in this image, I saw both the future nuclearization of atomic power, and I also saw the New World. So my whole Earth Against the New World actually is trying to theorize what is happening in this photo, because you cannot achieve 1/5, the conquest of 1/5 of the Earth's landmass in about 30 years without a kind of dual acuity, without a capacity for an aerial composition, without these kinds of tools. And so to me, it became important to understand that there is no nuclearization of state power, meaning that Europe, the West, brought the power or capacity to annihilate into the horizon of interstate politics. That being, again, that expression of final agency. You can understand that process without understanding this image itself. And that's what I'm trying to do across this little thought experiment. And so I think that just your remarks today shore up the way Earth remembers and the various scales we have to be attentive to in this process. And so I thank you for that.
I mean, can I just share a quick anecdote?
Yeah.
Speaking of the Earth remembering, I mean, I was when I was first speaking with Forensic Architecture about the film, because it was going to be a part of an exhibition that I was supposed to have done in Dresden last year. They were telling me that one of the days that they were there, like, bones emerged, not emerged in this kind of like dramatic way, but, you know, as people are driving over and everything, they found bones and like more bones. And I think a part of the crime scene conversation was that the police came and they had literally cordoned off the area where they had found human remains. And then like
that was an active conversation about human remains.
Yeah. Wow. I think I believe that was what that conversation was. But if not, that was a part of the experience of them going to Shark Island, quite literally stumbling across bones. And I think like the day after, there had been this kind of just this kind of hullabaloo of like trying to cordon them off so they could get kind of ancestral, spirit meat, like someone to collect them and go do something with them. The cordon had been taken away. And so, this confrontation of, you think it's okay to be in a cemetery. It's not, it's not a metaphor. It's very much like you are on top of bones. And this is a huge part of the community's anger around the possible expansion of the Luderitz port, is the fact that there are people who, killed themselves, throwing themselves into water, who died in some way, and there are mass graves around the kind of coast and the periphery of the island itself, in addition to there being graves and people who became a part of the earth after they died, and they're just like, we are not able to dig up these bones to bury them, and we don't have permission from the Namibian government to turn this into a kind of sacred site that tourists can't drive over. And so they're in this really painful limbo of like waiting to see if the port is going to be built, and then also just watching all of these Afrikaners and other tourists just literally drive over the really haunting and haunted final resting place of their ancestors. And so here, there's this very
the production of open space.
Literally. And I think that a part of, and this is just maybe a temporal addition to this question of open space and thinking about finance capital in the present, is the participation of the leaders of the Black Westphalian state. Like, what and how are these African leaders kind of enthusiastically participating? Right. Because the national question is, of course, a question of ethnic annihilation. It's about all of these machinations of ethno-power, where you have certain native people who are able to helm the state. And to helm a state necessarily means that you participate in the dispossession of some group of people, which is always poor African people and particular kinds or particular ethnicities of people. And so we have this, I would argue like a similar or a continued and maybe different language project of mapping, but importantly, a new kind of identitarian regime of the mapping that is actually not that far away from the old mapping, because the Namibian government and the German government have been in really intimate cahoots in preventing the Nama and Ovaherero from participating in any kind of recognition politics. I'll stop. I know we have a film that we need to get to.
Well, no, you're here to speak. So I think the way that the project continues on, this relationship between absolute power and how it gets repurposed within the nationalist state, I think is a really important piece, because in Earth versus the New World, I'm trying to circumvent some of the conceptual idioms that we're used to, like nation, like all of the things I introduced the first workshop. This process of an autonomous frame is, can you generate like a perceptual universe that can tell the whole story through these terms? And I'm trying to do that over and over and over again. And what is, like I said, revealed on the other side when you use Earth and world as your constitutive terms, not nation or ethno or power, or what's revealed. Same with Western fundamentalism, and next week or next month you'll figure out my third frame. But I appreciate your emphasis on the ongoing creation of open space in Africa, our complicity in it.
I think a part of
that just makes me sense that Earth versus world is an appropriate way of targeting different modalities of power that still traffic in. To me, the original sin is the absolute state. So there's something about absolute state, absolute power as represented in atomic power that is being worked out across these various things I'm throwing at you.
I think that a part of this, and it's interesting because as much as we kind of create these hagiographies of the period of decolonization in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, African leaders were in on this very, very early. So I think it's in like the mid 60s that like the Organization of African Unity is like, this sovereignty problem, the self-determination thing is a problem, because what the nationalist project had to do was to kind of coalesce all of these sometimes disparate, sometimes not, ethnic interests into a kind of singular national identity. So after the state is formed, how do you keep it coherent? How do you keep it together? And so after, I mean, of course, you talked about Katanga, and the kind of the corporate-backed secession movement that arose there in response to Lumumba and his desire to kind of nationalize mineral profits. But you have these African leaders clearly understanding the number of secession struggles that are on the horizon, and they're like, we need to move the boundaries of self-determination, because self-determination is not for people, the self-determination is for the state. And so we see a movement away from self-determination to sovereignty and territoriality, to this reinscription of this idea of the border, of the line, of the map, and away from the possibility of kind of nationalism, like sub-state, kind of national sovereignties, where a national sovereignty has to be subordinate to the sovereignty of the state. And so, of course, when we see Biafra in 67,
example,
this is the crisis of the African sovereign, right? You have a group of people that have the audacity to make a claim of self-determining independent sovereignty. And it's interesting to see how the independent states on the continent so far either line up behind Biafra or line up behind the Federal Republic, the Nigerian state. Of course, Israel lines up behind both. But it's interesting to see the ways that immediately the kind of the project of Westphalia, this open space project that you're emphasizing really, really, really eloquently and so usefully, it eclipses any kind of liberatory possibility on the continent beyond a reformation and reorganization into these geographically bounded political units. It's interesting how and where you don't see anarchism popping up, and how and where it is or is not something that is meaningfully entertained. I think this is a part of why Mba and African anarchism is just like, we have these things, we have these communalist organizations, and like that's the kind of frame for thinking about non-state sovereignty. But I think that there's something bigger, and I don't know what it is yet. But I think that there's something else. And I think that a part of it has to be the fact that, like, the ethno-political question, which is the African national question frequently, is one that I think a lot of people have internalized, but don't confront very often. Like, ethnicity, it's a part of a sense of self, a sense of being in a collectivity, a sense of relating to others, and we don't necessarily know where it comes from. It's a kind of essentialism that it doesn't supplant race, but it becomes a kind of organizing form in the absence, for the most part, of white people in the everyday. In Zimbabwe, the way that this ethnic question, I think, was resolved was literally through a genocide. The state targeting a minority group as dissidents and destroying the political opposition that roughly represented those people. The ethnic question in Nigeria, again, when we talk about Biafra, was this genocidal blockade against the Biafran people until they surrendered. And we see it again playing out in all of these other contexts. The ethnic question in Tanzania being the displacement of the Maasai and other people from their lands in order to allow access to multinationals. And I think that in a lot of contexts, there's a way that the euphemism of unity performs this really, really violent kind of ordering of the state, of this spatial, and you aren't supposed to talk about the ethnic, even though, again, it's something that innately kind of orders so much of life in so many places. And I don't know. I mean, I guess this is what I'm trying to start thinking about next. And again, in the Namibian context, you have the kind of unruly Nama and Ovaherero who, through the process of independence, were talking about genocide and dispossession in a way that Kutako, who was a kind of leader of Herero nationalism, was like, no, or not Herero nationalism, of kind of nationalism, but he was Ovaherero. He was like, I literally separate myself from talking about colonial dispossession because we have a national project that we need to focus on. And so you see these rifts, and then you see it in the present where the Nama and Ovaherero once again are like suing the Namibian government, are trying to push the Namibian government on land reform as a part of what they understand as a part of their reparations. And more and more, I think we're going to see these African states kind of rallying around neoliberalism, making these deals with Western states to open themselves up more and more and more to extraction and kind of land expropriation. And so this question of earth becomes urgent in a way that is kind of hard to put into words.
Yes. I think you did everything that I said you would, which is add so much texture and historical accuracy, historical precision to my random ideas. No, but shoring up, giving context to Shark Island and the process that forensic architecture goes to. Because there's something I'm interested in modeling Earth. There's this interest I have in the various strategies we have to model Earth, the material secrets that get unlocked, right? Again, to follow Winter and her obsession with Copernicus, Columbus, Darwin, Fanon, and then herself, that unruly genealogy, which would be probably the lighthouses and the journey towards an emancipated human consciousness in her thing. Her interest in them is in the ability to effect an epistemological break that reorders material reality, that the world, the image of the earth, the nature of the earth is no longer the same after Columbus. There's something mutative about materiality, but it also exists in the mind. So I think she's obsessed with locating those things, and I am too, and continuing to press Earth for strategy, to continuing to press and defend Earth, because Earth's dematerialization is achieved through the disappearing of Africa. We're at 7:50. I know people are like, so what's the new world? So I'm going to just read one more slide and then maybe see if there are any comments in the chat or questions, and then give Zoe the final word. Okay, so I began by saying the New World is not a place Columbus discovered, but a mutation in human experience he advanced. This phenomenological mutation introduces an anti-Earth replicator code, that is a set of instructions, and a master form, that's the state, but also that metempsychotic idea of Africa, what Du Bois points to, that fractal thinking that Zoe's talking about, this reincarnation of Africa through various spatial needs and longings that continues to generate war power for the West and participate in that process of Earth power being converted into war and police power. For the celebrant, the New World event represents a miraculous emancipation of empirical reality, which you can see, that displaces the dominant image of the earth with a heretical proposition that the substance of the earth is in fact homogeneous. That is Euclidean and not ecumenical, right? Like no longer is there a fiery pit that you can fall into. All of a sudden, all the world is available, but not for what Césaire calls the exchange, the oxygen of exchange, but instead to institutionalize a settler genocidal drive within bourgeois power, which is what we described last time. From the observer ground of our autonomous frame of reference, the New World realizes and repeats the extraction and abstraction of Earth's surface from a prior order of subjective understanding or system of meaning. So, right, no longer, this is why I wanted to show the mermaid, right? So the 1766, this slave ship, a Dutch slave ship in the Indian Ocean, they decide to let the captives clean the weapons and they had been planning a rebellion. They take over the ship. We're good to go, but we don't know how to steer the ship. So they tell the captive whites, get us back to Mozambique. Turn this issue around, get us back. Instead, they're tricky, and the shipmasters continue on to Cape Town. And when they get to the shoreline, Masavena, the leader in revolt, is like, this does not look like my shoreline. The birds are different, which is funny because in Columbus's diary, when he knows he's about to hit the New World, he's like, I see birds, which, anyone knows, there's land. He's like, the birds are not right, the shadows aren't right, and the trees aren't right. But they convince him it's Mozambique. Then, through some wild ass shit, they put 3 messages in a bottle, the white captives on the ship. They send them to shore, and some Dutch people get these notes and realize that the ship has been taken over, and they're able to, stop the rebellion, capture all of them. And then the 2 leaders get sent to Robben Island, which we know becomes an essential kind of carceral space during apartheid. And for somebody like Nkrumah, so I'm trying to bring all these things together, he put the Sahara Project, which is France's testing of atomic weaponry in the Sahara Desert, side by side with a South African apartheid as 2 spatial issues that Africans had to handle. So there's just something here in this mapping and extraction and this accumulation of unprecedented methods and forms of war power that's going on. Anyway, so from our reference, abstracting Earth from a prior order of knowledge, a prior system of, I was talking about the slave rebellion. Yeah. So you don't know where you are. That's the point. You don't know where you are because you've been abstracted from your system of meaning, and you don't actually know that yet. That the way you read Earth no longer corresponds to the way power is being organized at the surface of the Earth. There's a perceptual gap. You don't know where home is. You can engage in the most brilliant method of armed and collective armed struggle. You can take over the ship. You do not know how to drive it, and you actually don't know where you are located. To me, there's an existential message in that. And so in that process and it's happening again, where they take Earth's surface outside of the modality within which we know it, our system of meaning, our subjective understanding, and is being repurposed. That's what Palantir is doing, such that Earth's surface will no longer be the same after what they're up to and after Trump has secured Congo's mineral rights. So you're taken out of your system of meaning, and that is through the absolute state and absolute power. It carries the traces from me of that original structural thing that you encountered, which was the Spanish monarchical state. That's what mediates New World religion. The absolute state, the hypercentralization of political power, and the decentralization of private property rights. Those are 2 motions that the absolute state accomplishes. That's key. That's how master and state become, to me, the thing that we have to figure out. Anyway, so the absolute state carries with it its own science of destruction, which is how we call the atomic bomb. But humanism is the science of destruction. Its principle of ruin, Césaire again. And that's formalized by this genocidal passageway between Europe's cartographic point of view and this ongoing struggle to solve by force the question of human consciousness. That's who we are, why we're here, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where I'm going with the New World. And I hope that things started to come together. We didn't get to see the mermaid, but I think I just described to you the point of a science of the earth, of knowing where one is, of what intellectual resources that requires, and every kind of emancipatory breakthrough brings with it a new image or new concept of earth, and we must be working on that as well. 5 minutes. Zoe, final word or comments in the chat? Or
I think my final word would be, okay, this might be controversial. I think that the kind of Pan-African desire nostalgia, which is kind of realized and materialized through what's his name, Ibrahim Traore, particularly in Burkina Faso, as this kind of new Sankara. I think that we need to be very careful about, in this kind of like leftist imaginary of the continents, to not re-abstract Africa. Yeah. And I think I see a lot of the re-abstraction of the continent through the kind of affixation of like free a place. So I see free Congo, and I'm like, okay, free Congo from who? Are we saying free Congo from Kagame? Free Congo from the Congolese president who just signed this deal with both Rwanda and Trump? Are we saying free Congo from all of these different warlord figures?
World system.
Are we saying free Congo from racial capital? I think that, and I don't want to like be pedantic, but I think it's a very, it's a serious question. And I go back to what what I've encountered guerrillas telling me about ideology, and a number of them have been like, yeah, fighting against white people wasn't an ideology. And I think a part of the kind of difficulty in the politic is like, there's either then a strange ideological imposition and desire onto the continent that is really devoid from material reality and kind of, and kind of just exists purely in the imagination. And I, in having conversations with folks who trained, they're like, yeah, we had, depending on who they were and what part of the kind of axis of socialism they were on, whether it was kind of Chinese, like Maoist or Marxist-Leninist, we had Red Army commanders or Soviet commanders in our training camps teaching us how to be Maoist and teaching us how to be Marxist-Leninist, because it was something that like we very much aspired to, but we didn't really always have an analytic of capital. And so we didn't really know how to communicate any of these ideologies to people. And that's a part of, I think that obviously a part of this has to do with like a number of coups that happened after independence. But I think that arguably this is a part of why the revolutions didn't stick. Because even as there was deeply organic moves to liberate from European kind of domination, then what? Often. Again, the then what in a number of places where a lot of people got murdered, and in their place was an installation of an anti-communist leader. I mean, this is very much what comes up out of the aftermath of the Congo crisis. We have a kerfuffle, and then we have Mobutu. We have someone before Mobutu, but we end up with Reagan's favorite, Mobutu. But I really kind of implore us to, and again, this has to do with an insistence on specificity, to like have a little bit of clarity as to what you are liberating from and in which direction.
Yes. And that is the question of the abstraction of dissent, Dyson, versus a functional abstraction and instrumental, which you were so right. Free Haiti, free. I called it a chain of signifiers the last workshop, that I was like, I'm trying to create some material underbelly that makes them, we are searching for the connective tissue, and we fall back. I do it myself, because you're like, what's my laundry list of major global concerns right now to communicate my solidarity with? And so how do you move from the chain of signifiers to the total account of how power is, or something like that, is part of this autonomous frame. And so I think it's the perfect reminder that abstraction is it's that dual edge that we talked about with Ogu. And so it's always about refining an abstraction that moves from the bones as opposed to the theory. And I think that you've really emphasized that tonight. And I thank you. I thank everybody for being here. And the last workshop is on August 5th. I think I'm going to come back to some of these things. We'll be going on to Toni Morrison and George Jackson, and my thinking around Black studies and Black studies as the maybe the best way of thinking some of the problems put on the table over these past couple of months, which is an autonomous frame of reference. So we'll get into a little bit more of the body-mind connection as well, which I think George Jackson and Toni Morrison do with a power that's really unrivaled, is the way they bring the body to, let's say, the setting of the New World and to the world, the Western fundamentalist world system, to start building up the terms. But I thank you all. This time I'll try not to crash out and send more emails in between the workshops and actually be in touch and send some of the materials that Zoe talked about this evening and other materials, and just be a little bit better about the in-between workshop communication, because I very much enjoy everybody's feedback and thoughts and the things they're creating and the ways they're, just all the things. So fight on. I appreciate you all. Jay, do you have anything to say? I'm glad you weren't wiped out by a tornado.
No, I actually lost power for like 6 minutes at the end and thought it would take the stream out. And fortunately, I finally got back in and you all were still going. So I was like, oh, thank goodness. But no, this was awesome. Thank you both. It was really beautiful, moving, all the things. So I appreciate you hosting, Felicia and Zoe. It's great to see you again and to hear from you. Yeah.
Glad
all right, thanks everybody. What's that?
I'm glad your home is standing.
Yeah. My kids are running up and down the stairs. Yeah, it's wild. All right. Have a good one, everybody. And the next one, the date on it is August. Remind me. 5th. August 5th is the next session, everybody. So if you have not, by any chance, there is a link in the show description where you can register and get all of Felicia's emails and materials in advance of the next upcoming workshop. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.